Welcome to the 2:15 p.m. Speaking series. We have myself, Monty Kerley, and then Spencer Wolters, Dr. Spencer Wolters, DVM, is after me. And FBN implemented a policy for this farmer-to-farmer meeting. It's been a hiatus, I think, for 2 years. It's the first one I've been to, but anyway, they changed the structure around to where they wanted the best-looking speakers in a series to go first. And so Spencer is after me, and the rest of the week, I'd just like you to tell Spencer you were second, based on looks, if you don't mind. So Monty Kerley, I started with FBN. Some of you, I think, were in the previous one that I did. Started with FBN in November of last year, so I'm looking forward to retirement in about 2 or 3 years. And I've really enjoyed the time here, and what's been interesting is, to me, is I was at the University of Missouri for 30 years, and then retired. Wanted to do a couple other things, got a home place I grew up on, got a little feedlot down there, and started getting some cows and doing that, and then was approached by FBN, and was intrigued by what FBN was doing, mainly that they would let me put diets together for beef cattle that were based on amino acids, and also have a focus from a company standpoint on feed efficiency and what we can do there. And that's really what I want to talk about. So Dina, how long do we have to have the disclosure up to be legally okay? Long enough? All right. So the topics that I want to talk about here the next few minutes are really the top 4, and I want to spend most of the time on feed efficiency and residual feed intake. Feed efficiency, you know that. If you own cattle, you know what feed efficiency is, and really we translate that into cost of gain. Probably would have been better if I'd put cost of gain on that. Interested, everybody that hands up that has used residual feed intake EPDs or had a focus on that, or know what residual feed intake is? Dr. Dudley's the only one. That's because he's had to listen to me for the past year talk about that. I want to get into residual feed intake here in a couple of slides and talk about that. I think it's one of the best kept secrets in beef cattle, and amino acids are probably now the second best kept secret. But those two things, how we balance the diet to optimize feed efficiency, and then if we can get genetics for residual feed intake, have got more potential impact than anything I know of on reducing cost of feed, cost of production in beef cattle. If we look at a lot of models, don't care if you like them or you don't like them, if we look at a lot of models that's targeted methane reduction, and they'll target a lot of times you'll see 20% or something like that. We can have technology off the shelf we can take in diet balancing and residual feed intake, and we will blow past 20% reduction in methane emissions by beef cattle. Now, we can talk about how good that is. The whole interest that we have, the interest that I have is, what do we do to reduce feed costs and make a better animal? I want to spend a little bit of time on bunk management and carcass value, and then the tap dance routine of cost of disease for dairy and beef, Dr. Wolters will do. All right, average daily gain in feed efficiency. So if we take a calf, and that calf goes from 600 to 1,400 pounds, we put 800 pounds of gain on that, and I charge 35-cent yardage to that calf. How many people are higher than 35 cents that you charge? So you have to do the math on your own, but put the math in there what that cost you. Point I want to make this, I contrast average daily gain of 4 to an average daily gain of 3. I've got different number of days on feed on that animal. What that has cost me, though, in yardage is that $70.88, right? If I keep feed to gain the same, took the same feed to get them to that point, what I've lost, though, is a difference in yardage. And we talk a lot about average daily gain. I like to use the phrase, if you golf, you've heard you drive for show and you putt for dough, right? You lose your money when you putt. Well, average daily gain is for show and feed efficiency is for the dough in cattle production. And that's the only difference, $18 a head. If I look at a feed to gain of 6.5 versus a gain of 5.6, then I got $79 per head in that calf. And so the advertisement I'm making to you is feed efficiency, how we balance that diet to get amino acid requirements met. That's a big thing that you're gonna, if you're come to these talks today and if you visit with us over the course of the week, you're gonna keep hearing that broken record about amino acid nutrition. And then this residual feed intake or metabolic efficiency have got really huge impacts in terms of what they can do in cost of production. All right, so I said those two things. Diet formulation, balancing for amino acids to energy in the diet, same way that the pig guys and the poultry guys do, and selection for metabolic efficiency. First thing that we look at when we look at a diet, or if we want to build a diet from scratch, is we look at this energy efficiency ratio. So cattle use energy for maintenance, and so if you do the net energy system, you would know this is net energy of maintenance, 77 megacalories per kilogram of body weight, metabolic body weight. And then they use energy for growth, protein and lipid retention, and they lose energy as methane. All right, so if you feed cattle, one of the things you look at, it's going to be on performance beef, cattle, or whatever program you use, but you're going to look at that and you're thinking about what NEG you have going into that calf. You're going to start at a whatever, 40, whatever NEG, and you're going to end up at a low 60s NEG or have that kind of spread in the diet. NEG doesn't do a good job describing the energy that calf needs to grow. And so what we found was, and some research that I had done, NE wasn't describing what these calves were doing. We balanced for the amino acids. NE values were saying these calves were eating like 70% of what they needed for their growth. That didn't make any sense, and that's what put us on the quest to try to find out what's going on here. And there's a guy that back in the 80s published some work, and he was spot on. His big difference is NEM he uses, but NEG, he says, you can't have one energy value that describes protein retention and lipid retention of the calf. So he broke that into protein and lipid retention and came up with here's the amount of energy calf needs for its maintenance of its body weight and for however much growth you want. And so what we do is we take a diet or look at a diet and we want to calculate the energy efficiency ratio. And that's simply the amount of energy that's consumed to the amount of energy required by that calf. And when we've looked at most of the diets that are fed commercially, they'll fall in the range of 1.05 to 1.2, meaning that calf's eating 1.05 times more than what it needs or 1.2 times more than what it needs. So when we look at that value, what we conclude from that is we got an opportunity to improve efficiency here by 5 to 20%, whatever that number comes out to be. And that's what we chase. Or if we start with a diet from scratch, we'll take what ingredients you have, what we need to add to that, cheapest cost, to get the energy where we need it at, and then we balance the amino acids to that energy. Same thing the pig guys do when they look at lysine to digestible energy, and then a ratio of all the other amino acids to that. And what we think is when we see that EE ratio over 1, almost always that can be linked back to an amino acid deficiency of that calf. So this would be an example of what we would come out with. At the top, we've got the dry matter, the organic matter, and crude protein of the diet. In the middle, you can see what the composition of that diet is. Then we have the amount of dry matter intake, as-fed intake, and then initial weight, end weight, average daily gain, and feed conversion ratio. In the box down there, that's what we would look at. So the first thing we do is we look at EE ratio, and it says that calf is at 1.2. PEP ratio is the amount of peptide nitrogen that the bacteria in the rumen need. It's over 1, that's good. The RDN crude protein, we'd say that needs to be brought up to 0.7. We'd use urea to do that. Non-protein nitrogen, ammonia is what we need there. The biggest thing on this diet, though, is our EE ratio is 1.2, and we come over to those blue bars, and what we're calculating is lysine is only at 92% of requirement, all right? And this is biology, so there's a little bit of noise in these numbers, but that's been a consistent clue to us. These calves have got more energy than what they need to maintain themselves and to grow, but what's limiting that calf is amino acids. And a majority of the diets we see are like that. So our interest is what would happen if we go into that diet and we alter it, we add some protein, the right type of protein, to bring the amino acids that's limiting. In this case, we'd go find something that brought lysine into this, like bean meal. We'd optimize that diet, and then what we would expect is intake would come down on this calf, and we'd get a lot closer to that EE ratio being around 1 rather than 1.2. So this is an example of one set of calves that a producer had, gave us a couple of pins. You can look at the beginning body weight and the end body weight of these two calves. The top diet is control, that's what the lot was using, and the one below it was where we balanced the amino acids, the energy in that diet. All we did there was we pulled some distiller's grains out and went back in with a protein blend that balanced the amino acids. That's about, it was I think around 4% of the diet or something like that. Intake and average daily gain, feed to gain and cost to gain need to be swapped, mistake on my part. But intake, this is pretty typically what happens. When we balance the diet, what we do is we see a drop in intake. All right, we've gained efficiency in that calf. Rate of gain stays the same, 3.0 versus 3.1. To me, that's the same rate of gain in these calves, but we did that with less feed, and that's where the savings comes at. Now, feed to gain and cost to gain, flip those. So the feed to gain for the control diet was 7.4, 5.9, just under 6 for when we balanced the diet, and then cost of gain, we got, what is that, 8 cents cost of gain advantage whenever we balance that diet. Now, when we balance the protein, typically we bump that diet up 10 to 15 bucks in terms of cost per ton, but the advantage we get in terms of feed efficiency typically more than pays for that. Now, residual feed intake. So I've done my advertisement for balancing for amino acids. I want to look at residual feed intake. So the residual feed intake is a measure of a calf's intake relative to the contemporary group that calf was fed with. So if you look at the green line on there, that would be the regression of intake on average daily gain in body weight for the average of calves that were fed in this test, or as this contemporary group. Anything above that line is a positive residual feed intake, or a plus RFI. What that means is calves above that line, they required more feed to do the same thing that the average calf was doing. The negative RFIs are calves that took less feed than the average to do what those calves were doing. It's body weight and its rate of growth. Every group of calves that we've done experiments on when I was at the University of Missouri, if we looked at that, we always had 2 calves gaining the same weight. Great gains on them. They'd be well above 3, sometimes above 4. Great gains on those calves. But you could always find the spread on that was 40% difference in feed intake. So if I look at the average population that I'm feeding, and if I could select for this trait, what I've got without multiple year selection for that, the potential to reduce feed intake by 20%, still have the same gain, still hang the same carcass from that calf. And that's why this is a really big deal. The SIRE A and SIRE B, we've had a lot of interest in people. We've done different SIREs and looked at this, and what we said some time ago is we're going to forget the registration numbers on these bulls, and we don't want to get in that match. This gives an example of the population average that's out there. SIRE A, the average of his calves, and each of these bulls had at least 15 steer progeny that we tested. 3.8 on their average daily gain. SIRE B was 4.1. Which of those bulls would you want to use? Don't look at the rest of the data. All you know is 3.8 versus 4.1. You want SIRE B, don't you? I want growth, man. I want growth. Think about our first slide. Calf intake, SIRE A, 23.7, SIRE B, 21.0. So I've dropped 3 pounds dry matter intake on those calves. Feed to gain, 6.3, 5.1. Calf residual feed intake, plus 0.73, positive. and minus 0.60. There's one producer I work with, he's 6, 7, 8 generation selection for this, and the better end of his bulls will consume 65% of population average and still have the same growth and stuff. So one of the things that we're looking at with FBN is the diet, but also interest in how we can help highlight this more in the industry, and these two things are big. Real quick, I want to go through this slide just because I think it has some interest in demonstrating the combination of the amino acids and the residual feed intake or efficiency. So the diets, the percent amino acids, that is the percent of the most limiting amino acid that was available to the calf. So we fed 80%, and these are negative, would be the minus RFI calves or the calves that were efficient. We have average calves fed a diet that was 100 and 120% of amino acid requirement, and then positive calves, or the calves that were not average but were inefficient, fed 100 and 120%. What I'd like you to look at is the feed to gain on that. So look at the negative 100% of the amino acids. That calf had a 5.4 feed to gain. That's what that whole population would be chasing. If we shorted the amino acids in that calf, they couldn't do as well, even though they were negative. When we increased the amino acids, it didn't do any good to them. We go over to the average and the positives, and they responded the same. If we gave them 100% of the amino acids, their feed efficiencies weren't as good. When we bumped, though, the amino acids 120%, we got an increase in feed efficiency in those calves. So it's a lot of this we're still working out, but the thing that intrigues us and what we're hopeful is we're the ones that get to bring this to the forefront or help in bringing it to the forefront are what these genetics can do and what they mean in terms of cost of production. All right, receiving calves. We're going to start those at 1.2 to 1.5% of body weight. The rule I'm going to have on those is we bump those 1 pound per head every third day. We want to acclimate them to the starch in the diet, and we want them to have adequate bunk space, right? So now let's go through this a little bit. A lot of the diets we work with, producers will have like 5 step-up diets they go through in 3 days. That's a bit of a joke. But they'll have 5 step-ups that you go through, and then you're on what that last diet is typically until you're done with those calves, right? And so the advertisement here is thinking about, rather than those 5 steps, start those calves at 1.2, 1.5% of body weight, and then bump them 1 pound per head per day. Probably the biggest thing that we see and work with is bunk management of the calves. So like if I bring calves in, they have hay the first day in the bunk, then we'll start feeding them the diet, and we'll work them up until we get close to 1.8, 2% of body weight, and then we let them go. And we don't worry about giving excess or additional hay to them. But the whole point is we want to get this rumen acclimated to starch. Another way is we start with a moderate energy, like a lot of people use the step-up diets, start with a moderate energy diet, and then we work up to starch in there. All we're trying to do is to get the rumen acclimated to the amount of starch that's going to get fermented in it. And then bunk space is when we're limit fitting those calves, just make certain there's plenty of bunk space that they have access to. Reading bunks. So the number one rule, and I give a lot of credit to that 1 pound every third day to Robbie Pritchard at South Dakota in terms of kind of publishing that and putting some wind under the wings of that whole program. Growth performance. Number one thing I think is important about thinking about bunk management. Growth, a lot of research has shown this. If you feed a calf 95% of what its ad lib intake would be, so I talked about this earlier, but what's been done in that work is they would feed a pen of calves, they would look at the intake, the next day they would feed in another pen of calves 95% of that. So they replicate that, but that's how they did the protocol for that. Calves that got fed 95% had the same rate of growth as calves that were fed ad lib. Now, how do I interpret that? I interpret that this calf had all the feed in there he wanted, that what that calf was doing, when he back out of the bunk, he would lose some out of his mouth, and really you're looking at some loss there. And that's why those two are I think you see those two being the same. What I think is important from that, though, is that we're better off being a little bit behind that calf than we are in front of that calf. Now, that doesn't mean we don't push for intake and we don't want to get them there, but if we pull that calf back, and if somebody's getting nervous saying, well, you know, the next day I need to bump them again, don't do it, all right? Don't be like a bug and go for the light. Don't do it. Keep the rumen healthy. Diet conditioning, and we talked about, had a question, we talked about that in the last session. The goal is to make that diet look the same at 7 a.m. in the morning or at 5 p.m. in the evening as it does at 7 a.m. in the morning, right? And so it's a real advertisement that if you have a dry feed, think about something going in there, liquid molasses, something goes in that diet to condition it, prevent the buildup of fines, even distribution in the bunk. I got a kicker. There's a couple of guys that they got a new person, younger gentleman to drive a feed truck, and they were relating that it's hard to get speed, open the tray, all that, the door on the slot door and stuff, all coordinated. And when they start, that they said that they'll dump it all like in 4 foot of the bunk. And they said that what we learned was if they have to spread that out with a shovel, it's amazing how quick they learn how to get everything coordinated, where you get even distribution in the bunk, right? Very important, even distribution. Limit fed, if you do that, bunk space, big advertisement for that. Ad lib, most of the text and numbers would say 6-9 inches per head, and then just advertising again the 1 pound, 1 pound per head every 3rd day. Advertisement for cost of energy. So a lot of times I think in the beef business we'll go out and oftentimes we look too much at cost per ton and not cost per unit of energy. So corn, ME 1.44 megacal per pound, $7.20 a bushel. Is that about right? More or less than that. I bought corn 2 months ago at $7.20 and it's down at $6.95 now, close to me. So I know how to buy corn. $7.20 a bushel, 257 bucks a ton. Corn gluten feed. If I get corn gluten feed and equal energy to corn, it has to be 227 bucks a ton or less. Same for soy hulls. Distillers grains can be equal priced. We're going to say it has the same energy. But then the hay is where things get interesting, I think. Alfalfa has to be 182 bucks if it's 42 NDF and 22 crude protein. Good or bad alfalfa, 22 protein. I mean, a dairy guy would be feeding that, right? So good quality hay, I have to buy that under 182 bucks a ton if it's as good a buy to me as what corn is for energy. Can anybody buy alfalfa for 182 bucks a ton right now? Can't do it, can you? But Gary, you would buy it if you could, right? But we can't buy that. So point of that being is thinking about what the cost of energy. Now, let's build a supplement. So I purchased brome hay, 71% NDF, 6 protein, 0.9 megacals of ME. The ME requirement for this 1,400-pound cow that's making 18 pounds of milk per day is 30 megacals. So she's got to have that much groceries if she's going to keep doing what she wants to do. We'll use a rule. It's not always perfect, but it's a rule that we use where we'll take that the cow can eat 1.2% of its body weight in NDF. So this brome hay is 71% NDF. So if I take 120 and divide that by 71, that cow then, at least according to the papers, can eat 1.7% of her body weight in dry matter intake. That's 24 pounds of dry matter intake, and if I multiply that times the energy, I get 21.6 megacals. That cow, how much time is that? 5 minutes left, right? If I take that cow and I look at the energy she consumed, she's 8.4 megacals short in terms of what she needs to do her thing. If I assume all that energy has to come off of her back, that's 2.6 pounds of body weight she's going to lose per day. Now, in reality, she's going to lose weight, but what's she going to do to milk production? She'll also shorten milk production some too, right? So that's what's going to happen to that cow. I'm taking groceries off her back, and I've limited what that calf can get. So if I don't want that to happen, I've got to do something about that deficiency. One trick we know is if I go in with 0.2% body weight corn to a ruminant that's eating forage, I'll increase forage or fiber digestibility, and I'll increase the amount of microbial protein that goes to the small intestine that gives her amino acids she can work with. So kind of carte blanche, I'm going to do 0.2% of body weight corn. That's almost 3 pounds of corn, and that gives me 4 megacals of energy. That limited amount of corn almost takes care of half of the energy that cow needs. Then I look at the deficiency. If I go to soy hulls and use them, they're worth about 1.3 megacals per pound, so I need 3.4 pounds of soy hulls. So brome hay ad lib, and then I'm going to use 6 pounds of supplement, 45% corn, 55% soy hulls. That's going to have her where she needs to be from an energy standpoint. The ration calculates out to be about 6.8% crude protein. That's okay for the rumen. I don't need to add anything else for the bugs in that rumen. They're going to do life just fine. If I am worrying about something, I'm going to worry about what do I need to do to feed her if I've got low protein in that diet for milk production, maintenance, and all that. And then the end of this is we've had several producers that use liquid molasses-based supplements. 4 pounds of that, if you have that in a lick wheel feeder, that's about where they plane out at in terms of 4 pounds per day. And that's going to give you about 3.2 megacals per day of energy and some NPN if you need it. Now, 2 advertisements in there. The liquid molasses can help you on the energy. The same sugars that's in the molasses is going to help fiber digestibility just like that starch did. So you have kind of a nice double whammy there. If you're feeding a cool season grass, almost all those grasses are going to be 9% or higher in protein. Anytime you've got a forage that's running 8, 9% protein, the bugs aren't going to get any bang for the benefit out of NPN going into them, urea, biuret, whatever that is. So if you're out looking and you say, man, I want this 40% liquid supplement over 20%, or I want this 40% tub or whatever over 20%, if the cows don't need that nitrogen, you've just made life rougher with them. Because once you meet what the bugs need in the rumen, that cow has to take that ammonia. She has to convert it to urea, and that costs her energy. So if you're in a drought, you've got poor quality hay or whatever, you've just required her to spend more energy just to stay alive and not die from ammonia poisoning. She has to take more energy to do that. So I guess the take home of that always is not, more is not always better, right? But kind of look at that, and when you're looking at protein, what's going into these cows, make certain you've got the right type of nitrogen in there that it needs. All right, summary. Cost of energy, forage quality, thinking about that NDF and the crude protein, the supplement effects on forage digestion. We're not only trying to get more energy if that's what she needs into her, but we're wanting to balance that right? Whether it's a cow on forage or whether it's that calf on a corn diet or a silage diet in the feedlot. We want to balance that so that we optimize that. And then the type of the protein, NPN versus true protein. And going back a little bit overlaying the earlier talk is about amino acid nutrition. So we're going to, Dr. Wolters, you're going to go next, and we'll do questions afterwards, right?
Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Wolter, and I'm one of the veterinarians at Southwest Veterinary Services. And today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the true cost of BRD. I assume everyone in this room has been affected by it in one way or another, and I think it's a skeleton we all have in our closet. So we're going to go over some pretty basic stuff in the beginning. So an initial upfront cost with BRD is you vaccinate against it, you treat for it, inevitably you're gonna have some retreats as well, labor and shoot charges, especially if you're a custom feeder, and then the biggest one on a lot of our minds is mortality. The things that aren't the obvious glaring money losers on BRD is the reduced average daily gain we see with an animal that has been affected by BRD. The increased cost of gain, because they're not as efficient with the same bite of food as the neighbor next to them that never got sick. There's usually longer days on feed because they're not as efficient either because of the permanent lung damage. Reduced slaughter weight, hot carcass weight goes down, which we'll talk a little bit more on a few slides. And then decreased grade as well. You don't get as good marbling and going after that choice and prime, which is always on the forefront of our head when we send a load of cattle out. So some fun facts to kick off the talk for us to think about as we go along. First treatment on a 7-8 weight calf is right around $23. The worst case scenario, chronics, 3 treats are usually $70 to $90. That's usually drug costs plus or minus a little shoot charge in there. But what, in fact, when I was Googling around to make these slides that I thought was quite impressive was that the mortality costs anywhere from $800 to $900 million in annual revenue decrease because of BRD. So that's a pretty startling number. So it's something we have to pay attention to. And then this last fact is going to come in handy later, is that a 200 and lighter pound calf takes roughly a pound of glucose to mount an immune response and fight off a pathogen. So BRD on production. So calves that do get pneumonia have that damage for life. They rarely can fix them back to 100%. So that can lead to a decrease of almost 0.6 pounds of average daily gain for the rest of their feeding period. So if they get sick, with pneumonia 10 days before the feed truck, it's not a big concern. But if you start feeding 2 and 3 weights, and they're going to be on feed 300 days or so, especially if they're dairy beef crosses, that 0.6 pounds a day for the rest of a 200-day feeding period, that really starts to add up. And then calves that fight BRD either don't gain at all or only gain a half a pound a day. So when you think about it, the calf doesn't feel that well, has to mount an immune response. That takes a lot of energy, basically taking feed out of its mouth. They get a fever, get lethargic, don't go up to the bunk, aren't even eating enough calories to take care of it. And then even after they overcome the pathogen, they have to put a lot of legwork in of healing their lungs. That takes a lot of energy as well, and that's how we can get either no gains or just barely a pound a day, half a pound, a day. So let's look at that worst case scenario, the monster in the room. Let's look at a 350-pound calf, normally would gain on average 2.5 pounds a day when healthy. So you get your first treatment, they're probably 2 weeks after they got off the truck, you have 1 treatment. You lose 7 to 10 days of production, which can equate to anywhere from 14 to 20 pounds. You found out that the bug was maybe a little resistant. The calf relapses 2 weeks later, loses another 7 to 10 days of production. Now we're at a total of 28 to 40 pounds lighter calf than the calf eating next to it that never got sick. And then on the chronic, the third, last case scenario, you gave the whole kitchen sink of antibiotics to them, lose another 7 to 10 days. Well, now you're looking at a 42 to 60 pound difference. And I know all of us have looked at a pen and seen those railers fall out as the feeding period goes on, right? And it's because of BRD and those chronic examples that we're losing real pounds. And right before I got up here, I looked at what the cattle markets were. It's actually $1.53, so it's not too far off of here. But even if it's only those 42 to 60 pounds, when they finally get to the packer, you're leaving $63 on the table from a respiratory disease that we can put some leg work in front of to prevent. So here's a cool packing plant data. It was a study on 840 head. And you can see the numbers there, but losing $23 from hot carcass because of 1 treatment, $30 from the second, and over $50 for the third. That's some real money that we gotta consider. Here's some more fun information, I think. The hot carcass on the top box is what I was highlighting, of 52.8 pounds difference in hot weight carcass, which is pretty close to that little imaginary example I gave about the chronic calf. So it does translate to real numbers. And then at the bottom, the worst case, the far left, the clinical column, those were evaluating the lungs. And if they had severe lung lesions, they were in that category, you could be losing $213 per calf that had 2 or more treatments on it. And then those that were just subclinical, the animals in life didn't have any reports of BRD events, but had lung lesions, still lost $67 a head. So that was a lot of scary information, some not fun numbers to sit on. So what can we do to help all this money going out the window because of BRD? First thing is, and Dr. Kerley talked about it a little, is we got to build our cows. So we have to vaccinate them before they give birth with enough time that when we give them a vaccine, they can put all those valuable antibodies into the colostrum to make sure that the calf is set up from day one. Because calves use their mom's immunity, passive immunity from the colostrum for the first 6 to 8 weeks. So it's important that we help mom make as good of colostrum as possible so we're not fighting pneumonia so early in life. You also want to make sure we have good body condition scores. As I said, calves under 200 pounds take a pound of glucose itself to mount a response. So if mom doesn't have a good body condition score going in to calving and being able to make milk, we're going to be calorie deficient before we even get them at the feed yard, before weaning. And then also body conformation and genetics are always important to make sure that the calf will live out there on pasture. So early identification is a crucial part of this BRD. So we got to know the signs early, and we got to train our employees to be able to detect them early. And I know that's a hard ask. I mean, it's difficult, but building really good employees and helpers for identifying these pulls is going to help you save from getting to that chronic calf. So some of the signs we look for is, nasal and ocular discharge, we're all familiar with, cough, lethargy and depression, kind of the same thing, labored breathing, and then that ganted up, not eating, like dry nose calf are all things to look for. And I have some benchmarks on here so the first case success rate is important for us to be able to evaluate how we're doing on treating BRD. So if we have 10 calves in front of us and we pulled all 10 for respiratory, treated all 10 for respiratory, and all of them got better, did not need a second treatment, we'd have a 100% success rate, but we don't always want that. We want to have to retreat some of them because we might be pulling too deep in that situation if we have a 100% success rate. Now, on the opposite side, if we treat 10 and 5 of them need to be retreated, we're probably not pulling deep enough. And a lot of you might be asking yourself, outside of just treatment success, how else do we know if we're doing our pulls at the correct depth? Well, average pull temp, like rectal temp, is a big help there. So if it's 104 to 105, 104.5 is what I prefer. And if it's hotter than that, we're letting that calf be sick an extra day to get that high of a temp. We want to bring it down. So maybe pull a little earlier, a little sooner. And if it's below then, 103.5, 103.8, we might be over pulling and might be wasting some of those antibiotics. And when it's $23 for the first treatment, we maybe don't want to be pulling for that bottle of Draxxin just quite yet. An important thing to know is who we're fighting. It's hard to mount an army, if you will, against BRD as far as vaccine protocols and antibiotics without knowing who the actual individual is. So diagnostics are crucial to know which bacteria pathogen is in the lungs. It's also important to do culture and sensitivity to know which antibiotics will actually work against the bacteria that we're fighting. If you have mycoplasma, we all know Draxxin works really well for that, but we got to know if it is mycoplasma or not. Housing and stocking density, we got to think about who our neighbor is, right? Are we putting a bunch of new calves next to calves that are just 6 to 8 weeks older than them and having nose-to-nose competition, having those older calves immune competent to these ones that are maybe a little naive, that sets us up for failure in our calves breaking. Also, overstocking leads to constant stress, decreased feed intakes, and weakened immune systems. Access to clean and consistent water is important. Water drives dry matter intake just as much as dry matter intake drives water consumption. So it's crucial to always make sure that's readily available for all of our calves. And then ventilation is key. It's very tricky nowadays I come from Minnesota, and we can have a 40 degree temperature swing in a day, and that can make it difficult to accurately set ventilation, but ammonia can be a big player in ruining the defenses that our lungs have. So it's important to think about ventilation. So here's some of my benchmarks. Ammonia levels, anything at 10 or above, you're gonna smell, and that's gonna cause harm to their lungs. Calf space, it's 30 to 40 square feet, again, and for the cow-calf pairs. It's important that we're not stressing them, because when we have too little square footage per calf, they're not going to be thriving, always going to have stress and cortisol going through their system, and it's going to lead them to be predisposed to getting a respiratory pathogen. So, SOPs, treatments, and vaccinations, it's important to have written protocols, right? If you were the one doing the treatments, they're getting done the way you want, but you can't always be there every day, right? Or say your head herdsman is the one that always does the doctoring and treating on the pulls for the day. Well, maybe he had an emergency and couldn't be there. Having written protocols allows us to do them consistently and accurately to make sure that we're getting the best treatment and care for the calf that gets pulled for BRD. Also, you want to revisit SOPs annually. It's important because you have to look back at the year before to see, who were you fighting, and maybe we need to add an autogenous vaccine for that Histophilus we saw last year. Or maybe we don't need the salmonella vaccine because we haven't had a problem with it in years. So revisit those annually with your veterinarian. Also, you can have separate SOPs for what risk level the cattle are, if they're high or low risk. And then treatment records. You can look back and see, did we have a lot of pulls? So are we doing the right thing on vaccinations? Are we training our employees properly? It's important to look back at those records. If you write them down and never reference them, why are we writing them down? So make sure we look at them and learn from them. I won't talk much about this. I think Dr. Kerley did a really good job talking about nutrition, but a challenged calf uses a lot of energy. So it is crucial that we give them a high plane of nutrition so when they do go off feed, when they feel sick, when they have that fever, that they have the stores available to mount an accurate immune response for the to fight the pathogen. Also, if we do have those pesky calves that need to be bottle calves, make sure that they're getting at least 50 pounds of milk replacer in them before weaning. Here's my last slide. BRD is honestly like a big monster to tackle. It can really be a sieve on your pocketbook, and it takes a lot of players to be successful against fighting it. So, you're not on your own, and you don't have to be a one-person show. You got to lean on your team. We need committed owners that are looking for engaged veterinarians to help them train their employees, go over records, revisit SOPs annually. Also to have skilled employees and dedicated employees that are looking in the pen, taking the extra second to pause and be like, hey, that calf that's hiding back there with its head down, I think we need to pull him. Turns out he has a temp of 105. You need your nutritionists, financial advisors, and commodity wow, I can't say that word. You see it. But to make sure that we can keep raising cattle the next year, and then early and frequent communication is crucial between, your employees to the owners and employees to the veterinarians and nutritionists to make sure that we're all on the same page and we don't just come in when, there's a fire going on or an emergency. We want to be there and see the story before the fire. So being in constant communication, I think, is really valuable to help us solve big BRD outbreaks. And then data. I think I've stressed that enough, so I'll let that horse lie there. So thank you. I'll take any questions for me or Dr. Kerley if you have them.
And just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll run the mic over to you. You can ask your question and be heard by everybody.
Just on our quick note on our operation, small feed yard, getting a lot of calves in, 5 weights, coming from the west, Montana, Wyoming. We feed them in South Dakota. We get a potload of calves from, they're all put together, 6, 8, 10 from a ranch. There's 20 ranches on a potload. You dump 10, 12, 15 potloads together. What's kind of a thought on BRD and things to try and stay ahead of there? And you kind of talked about the cow-calf thing, but it's kind of ahead of our realm of things we can change there. Any ideas or thoughts? Sickness, mortality, rates, things to look at?
So having mixed cattle always makes them exceptionally, so having a mixture of calves that all come from different areas pretty much immediately classifies them as being high risk. So, I mean, getting a good vaccine program early, now that's not right off the truck, you know. You get them onto your place, they hang out for, 24 to 72 hours, so they're not super stressed, and you can use things like Enforce to try to give you immediate, submucosal protection, like nose protection, but then given a 5-way respiratory, it's so case-by-case dependent, but you can also temp calves as they come in when you process them, and anyone that temps do a prophylactic treatment of, Draxxin or XE, that type of thing. That can help you manage the risk when you mix them all together, or try to source, so you don't have as much commingling, but I know a lot of times that's not even possible, so it's really case-by-case different, but, exercising prophylactic treatments, making sure you're not crowding them in the pen, and starting them slow nutritionally or easy nutritionally, not a super hot ration right away, extra waterers in the pens, all of that helps reduce the calf stress and hopefully will lessen the impact of BRD on a mixed group.
If I saw that right, 2 to 3 months ahead of calving for the pre-calving shots?
Yep, for the initial ones. So when you give a vaccine, you might have some immunity 2 to 3 weeks after giving it, but for the cow to have memory to it, all the way into its B cells, and start producing these antibodies that we want in the colostrum, you really need 4 to 6 weeks in advance. But especially if we're using like a scour guard vaccine, you have to booster, you have to move your timeline up even earlier to make sure that mama cow has enough time to respond to the vaccine, make all the antibodies, and then deposit them in the colostrum.
Is that in a first calf heifer scenario or mature cows? Are you boostering the...
Yeah, those are first calf heifers. Cows you booster annually, usually when you do a preg check, but you don't want to be doing it, you don't want to be vaccinating them on their annual basis, say a month before calving. You want to make sure you're at least 2 to 3 months before they'll be calving to make sure you have the best antibodies in the colostrum. I guess all those years of being a professor, you really know how to explain things well. People don't have questions.
Yeah, so the question earlier on the calves you got commingled, like what % of them will break with BRD?
Oh, I'm just trying to think what our pull rates are on some of those pens. Right now, well, I'd say earlier when we kind of try and fill October, November, and kind of get full for the winter. When they first come in, I would say we're pulling a hard 3%, 4%. And then usually you get through 14, 21 days, 2-3 weeks, then they'll back off. Got around that 0.5%. We'll pull a couple. Usually our pens are 200 head to keep them smaller so we can ride better and pull better. But usually, they'll back down one, 2, 3 out of a pen a day. And they usually kind of break again in that 45-day range. You'll kind of get another wave, and then by 60 days, they're usually off and running.
Gotcha.
Usually, if things go well, we've stayed around that 3% mortality, on the group come spring when we turn them loose.
Gotcha. Morbidity or mortality is 3%.
Death rate.
Death rate is at 3%? Okay. Yeah, it's definitely a longer conversation, I guess, than a single question answered, but focusing on lowering their stress is probably the most critical part for those calves. We can dive in later on vaccine programs and then, like prophylactic treatments, either in the feed or through an injection, or even, trying to sort calves a little bit before you're full in different pens so they can become immune competent, or be ready to fight things off before commingling them. A lot of those are options too, so.
There's a person named Dave Hutchison who did some work, and what they did was they increased protein in the diet for calves that were shipped like that, and they saw an improvement in the calves. Now, my bias is that's what they did in the amino acids, right? They gave more amino acids. I think the trace mineral and the electrolyte thing, I think there's some reason, particularly those calves come in, their intakes are depressed a bit, that there's pretty good data that would say bumping, I think it's mainly the copper and the zinc probably from what it does to the immune system, but that and electrolytes. My view of nutrition is we might be able to do some things to help the calf get over the infection. I don't know that we can do much to keep it from getting the infection.
Right.
Right. I thought you said you had 3 to 4% sickness in the calves.
I did too, and I was like, that's impressive. I'll take 3% any day.
I'll bring calves to you to feed.